Hey guys, we're going to keep talking about ecosystems today, and we're going to talk about ecological pyramids. So this is going to be a graphical representation email of relationships in ecosystems. We're going to look at several different types. So there's pyramids that show productivity, biomass, numbers. There's pyramids for all of them. So what we're looking at here, this is the examples of Florida bog. We are looking at the dry weight, so the biomass of the producers, and then the primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then the tertiary consumers. Now down here we're looking at the same thing, but it's for the English Channel. And so one thing that you may notice is that we actually have fewer of the primary producers. Here we are looking at the actual number of organisms. So we're looking at the number of primary producers, and this is a Michigan bluegrass field. So it's going to be grasses. So these plants are going to be really, really small. So you're going to have lots and lots and lots of them. And then your primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then your tertiary consumers, you have very few. One thing I want to say before we move on from this slide is I want you guys to think about how this would look if we were looking at, let's say, a forest, where instead of having, 5.8 million of these tiny little grasses, the pyramid may look pretty different because you're not going to be able to fit in as many producers if they are these really big mature trees. And so this can change, the shape of this is going to change very much based on what kind of ecosystem you're looking at. Okay, so we've talked a lot about energy and how energy moves through an ecosystem with like the food chains and the food webs and how much energy goes from one trophic level to the next. But we also need to talk about chemicals and how they move through an ecosystem. And so chemicals will actually cycle, all right? And so matter is recycled through ecosystems, whereas energy only moves in one direction. And so we have talked about biogeochemical cycles in probably every year of science that you guys have had. And so we're going to go over that pretty quickly today. But understand that you have certain matter reservoirs within an ecosystem. And those are going to be areas where you hold organic and inorganic materials, and they kind of switch back and forth between being available for use and then unavailable. So like living things hold on to materials, and at that point they're unavailable for use. But when then living things die and they decompose, those materials become available again within the soil. So a few of the biogeochemical cycles that you guys have studied before would be water, carbon, and nitrogen. And you guys should know at least one of these really, really well in case it shows up on an essay question. So here is sort of your typical example of the water cycle. So pick a spot to start, and you guys should be able to talk your way through it. And so if you were going to start, let's say with precipitation over the land, so the water is going to fall to the ground once it gets there. Some of it is going to travel over land through runoff. Some of it's going to go down and travel through groundwater. Some of it's going to run to lakes and streams. Some of it's going to get taken up by plants. It can then be evaporated, or it can be lost through transpiration in plants and go back up into the atmosphere, or it can go to a larger body of water where again you can have evaporation and then more precipitation. So just make sure you can kind of talk your way through any point in that diagram. Here you're looking at the carbon dioxide. So if you were to start with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's going to be taken in by plants through photosynthesis. Those plants could get eaten by primary consumers. Those primary consumers would then get eaten by higher level consumers. All animals and plants are eventually going to die, so then it gets recycled back into the soil so it can be used again. And then we also have nitrogen. Nitrogen is going to be a little bit different just because you've got these nitrogen fixing bacteria that are going to be really, really important. But again, you should be able to kind of start anywhere on this diagram and be able to talk your way through, like once nitrogen has been fixed, it can be taken up through the plants. Once things are in plants, they're going to get eaten by the primary consumers. And just keep in mind that everything has to die, and so it's going to go back into the soil so it can get decomposed. So again, energy flows through an ecosystem and is mostly lost as heat, whereas matter cycles in ecosystems. All right, so it's never going to be lost, it's just going to be cycled through. So a quick question, what is man's influence on ecosystems? So this is actually going to tie into your lecture question, so I want you guys to kind of be thinking about this. The impacts that humans have on ecosystems tend to be very, very negative. What you're looking at here is the nitrate concentration in runoff. And so you have a control forest down here versus a deforested area. And so what happens is you have a lot more nitrates in concentration, you have a lot more runoff in general because the land has been stripped of all the trees and all the plants that were there. And so this is one consequence of something like deforestation. We also have something called biological magnification, and this is really bad when you look at like the chemicals that we use and the chemicals that essentially get put into our ecosystems, whether it's in the land or in the water. And what happens is the concentration of toxins in successive levels of a food web tends to build up or magnify. So here you have an example. So if you were looking at something like DDT in water, you have a very, very, very tiny amount in parts per million in the water. But as that water is used by zooplankton, you can see now that it is being magnified, and then again in small fish, then in large fish, and then finally you get to the birds that are eating these, and you have 25 parts per million. And that is a huge increase. So that's a 10 million times increase in the concentration of DDT in the food chain. And so the reason that this happens is that a lot of these chemicals aren't broken down by digestion, and so it concentrates and then it tends to affect the upper levels of the food web. Next, we've got greenhouse effects, and so this is when we trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere, and so things that are responsible for this, obviously carbon dioxide is the big one, but also water vapor and methane. Carbon dioxide levels have been increasing for a while now. So back in 1850, you were looking at 274 parts per million. By 1992, you're talking about 351 parts per million. And so the levels of carbon dioxide are rising, and the cause is pretty much due to us. So this ties in really closely with the Industrial Revolution, and as we started using more fossil fuels, the levels started rising pretty quickly. And you can see that as the carbon dioxide levels rise, so that's the black line on this graph, that the temperature is increasing as well. So again, industrialization is a big cause, burning fossil fuels, and at the same time as we're releasing all of this extra carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we're also cutting down our forests, so we're losing all of these plants that would take in the carbon dioxide and use it for photosynthesis. So the result of this is that the Earth will heat up. You've got the possibility of ice caps melting and sea levels rising. You tend to see climate shifts, intensity of storms, and actually there were a few articles that were just put out this past week saying that estimates of the Antarctic ice melting, like estimates that had come out a few years ago even, were way, way off, where they had said that the sea levels may rise by 2 or 3 feet. Now it actually looks more like 5 or 6 feet, and it's going to happen faster than they thought it would. Acid rain is another human-caused issue, and so this is caused by air pollution. It lowers the pH of rainfall, or it makes it more acidic. This can be really damaging to ecosystems, but also to our buildings, and in this picture you're looking at a statue and the effects of acid rain and how much of that statue has been eaten away. This is just a diagram that shows you guys the areas that are most affected by acid rain in the US. You can see that it's concentrated more in the eastern part of the country, tend to be where you see like large metropolises. Out towards the west in the central United States, it's not as bad because you don't have as many larger cities. But then again, where the cities do tend to pop up, you see a decrease in pH again. Next is habitat destruction. This is the worst problem threatening most other species today. So we've had just major impacts on the biosphere, and this is something that we really need to learn to work with before we start to see some really huge implications that we can't reverse. So again, the Antarctic ice sheets melting at this increased rate, the huge increase in sea levels, like those are things that we can't fix once they start to happen. So for this chapter, you guys should know the trophic levels of ecosystems. You should know an example of a food chain and a food web. You guys need to be able to talk about how energy moves through an ecosystem, how matter moves through an ecosystem. You should be able to compare the two. So again, energy flows in one direction, whereas matter cycles. You should be able to talk in pretty good detail about at least one of the biogeochemical cycles. And then you also need to talk about the human impact problem on ecosystems. And again, just in your own words, kind of talk to me about the ways that humans are damaging the ecosystems of the world. All right, thanks, guys.